Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. We will start our webinar in about 5 minutes. Please stay tuned. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Our webinar will start in a couple of minutes. Please stay tuned. Hello everyone, it's time to get started. I'm Scott Nabers, Director of Marketing here at Onvia, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, the P3 Revolution. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping deals to cover. First off, today's webinar is being streamed via your computer, so please turn your speakers on. If you would like to dial into the webinar, please use the number on the screen. Now, throughout the webinar, if you have questions, feel free to post it in the chat box. We won't necessarily answer them immediately, but we will try to collect the questions and answer them in order during the Q&A session at the end. And finally, the most commonly asked question that I usually get during a webinar is, will this webinar be recorded or will the slides be available? And the answer is yes. We will have the recording available about a day or so after the webinar is done, along with the slides. And we will be sending out a link to all of you to be able to review that at your own leisure. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're honored to have a renowned author and expert on P3s join us to talk about how the world of government contracting is changing. Mary Scott Nabers is President and CEO of Strategic Partnerships, Inc. She's been debating public policy since childhood. You can imagine her probably around the dinner table with her family thinking about the political issue of the day. She's had significant positions in Texas state government and has more than 15 years experience advising Fortune 500 companies on strategic government business opportunities. She is the author of Collaboration Nation. This is a groundbreaking book that we'll be touching on a little bit today on how government contracting is changing. Welcome to our session, Mary. We're very happy to have you.
Thanks so much, Scott. I'm glad to be here.
Great. So today, Mary is going to help us understand how public-private partnerships, and I'm going to refer to these as P3s going forward. I'll have you all try that by yourself sometimes to repeat that 10 times, and it's pretty difficult. So they are called P3s, and I think it facilitates the language a lot better. And we'll talk about the history of P3s, how they're being used today, how agencies evaluate potential P3 projects, and how contractors can get engaged in P3s and how companies can determine what are good projects they can pursue. Mary, thanks again for joining us. To get started, let's get a little background on P3s. Tell us how they started and how they've evolved.
Sure. Well, P3s have actually been around for a very, very long time, and they're attractive for a number of reasons. But they're especially attractive right now in America because we are out of public funding, and a public-private partnership is a wonderful opportunity for the public sector to get some private capital that they can put into these critically needed large public projects.
Great. So they're kind of reemerging, is that right, with more of a focus on the big projects for infrastructure, social infrastructure like schools, hospitals, and prisons, or other areas?
Yes, we're actually at a crossroads, Scott. We need trillions of dollars to maintain and rebuild our infrastructure networks. We need even more for water, for vertical construction, for other public projects. And if we don't address these problems, our economic prosperity is seriously jeopardized. So public-private partnerships have become very, very attractive to public officials today.
Great. Well, tell us a little bit about the history, if you will.
Sure. Europe started much before we did. Canada is ahead of us. Most other countries are ahead of us. But we are there now. We are on the scene, and we have had public-private partnerships for transportation projects for some time now. Vertical projects, vertical construction is where the trend is now, and universities and community colleges are just going gangbusters on P3s in that arena. And then we're starting to see the social P3s emerging. About 31 states, I actually think it's probably more like 33 because a number of legislative sessions are just winding up, but they've already passed enabling P3 legislation. So this is a massive trend. It's one that's moving, and America has become the new frontier for P3s today.
Yeah. So you noted earlier that a number of the areas, in need of funding, for new infrastructure. What are some of the specifics around, some of these funding needs or funding shortfalls?
Well, on the slide that's up now on the screen, if you look, you're going to see that we've got more funding needs than we can ever cover. And if this slide doesn't scare our participants today, they are a really tough crowd. The numbers are pretty staggering. Our basic needs are great. And as I said earlier, our economic prosperity is going to languish if we ignore these critical needs. On the flip side of that scenario, though, with P3s, we could start addressing these basic need problems immediately. And at the same time, we would see the creation of thousands of jobs. Local, regional economies would be stimulated in a way that would be significant. It's hard for me to understand why we in America are moving as slowly as we are today.
Yeah, so this really presents a revolutionary opportunity to get things going then. So it seems like, P3s, some people might think that they're sort of a new structure for projects, to pay for projects through user fees to private funders instead of taxation. Is that really fair to say? I know there's some criticism out there.
Well, P3s are attractive for all kinds of reasons, and certainly that's one of them. But let me just diverse just a moment and say to the people who are on this webinar, we are, without doubt, living through the greatest government transformation that we'll see in our lifetime. We do not have enough public funding, and so public officials now are being forced to look at new ways to fund these very large projects that are so desperately needed. P3s offer a very fiscally sound model. It's a model that's been tested. It's a very, very good thing. P3s also offer other benefits. They shift risk from government to the private sector. They provide absolutely sound financing modeling, and that's something that government has not always had in the past. And then the collaboration that has to result, if they're successful, is going to bring a lot of creativity, a lot of innovation and flexibility into government while cutting the costs to deliver citizen services. So all of those are good things.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I did read your book, of course, and I was pretty inspired by it. I think, this mix, where you don't have this sort of silos between government and the private sectors, P3s break that down, and you get the benefits of the efficiency that businesses pursue, along with government on sort of ensuring that these projects are going to go ahead in the right way. Maybe you talked a little bit about some of the risk areas, and maybe you could describe some of the types of P3 models and how they're being delivered.
Sure, and when we talk about shifting risk, if you look at the slide that's up on the screen now, on the far left, that's where a public official or a public entity holds on to most of the risk. As you go across the spectrum, all the way across to the right side, almost all the shift has been to move the risk factor to the private sector partner by the time you get to the concessionaires. So there are many, many ways to structure a P3, and every one of them is different. And part of the customization of these is how much risk does the public entity want to shift over to the private sector partner.
Great. So, what I think you're pointing out here is that the P3s really do help, with that risk sharing between the public and private sector. So is that right?
That's absolutely true. For a good, successful P3, public officials are reaching out to large and experienced contractors to help them build the specs, to discuss different types of options, maybe to find some innovation, and certainly to build the financial models for whatever type of engagement they prefer.
So if Petries, It seems like they're really important. We want them all to be very successful. And you say that there's guidelines, roadmaps, best practices. What are those best practices?
Well, and there are roadmaps and there are guidelines because these other countries have done this for decades, and we can look back and see what does make a P3 successful, what commonalities are there in those that are failed. So if we look at only best practices for success, the first one is early planning, good preparation. That's just critical. And then the financial forecasting. And most of the experienced contractors now in America are going to demand that, but certainly the public officials want that as well. A solid business model and one with clearly defined success. And when I say clearly defined, that communication has to be so good that maybe it needs to be written down. But there must be clear objectives, there must be performance measures that both parties understand exactly what it's going to look like when the success has been reached. It's also going to take a committed internal team, and normally there is an executive level champion. And if you go to the next slide, there are more best practices. With a P3, it's important to remember that there are always multiple stakeholders. And so stakeholder buy-in is very, very important. And that might be elected officials, it might be the public at large, it might be a neighborhood group, or maybe it's the media. But the stakeholders need to be identified, and they need some buy-in from the stakeholders. Communications are going to have to be open, and transparency is a mandate. The most successful ones also have clearly defined decision-making processes. They are flexible because most of them last over a couple of decades. And a realistic RFP response time for contractors to look at them, to plan for them, and to compete to be the private sector partner.
Great. So it sounds like, these are almost like just good business rules, and so this whole sort of best practices that you've talked about are fairly, I think, common, with companies in the out there today, commercial companies. But it also sounds like it's really critical for the size of these projects.
Well, it is, Scott, and if you go to the next slide, you're going to see that the P3s are normally very, very large public projects, and so it's even more critical. I mean, one little glitch can be monumental. So if you look at some P3 examples of successful ones in America, we've got an air terminal at JFK Airport. We've got a large facility at Montclair State University. And I'm not going to walk through the details of these because I think it's more important to look at the different and diverse types of P3s. So if we go on to the next slide, you can see we've got a desalination plant. And I can tell you that in Texas, we are going to see lots of water P3s in the coming months. And a lot of them are going to be desalination plants. Also in Texas, the Dallas Cowboys Stadium is one very, very successful P3. And then on the next slide, SH-130. I think the public is accustomed to seeing toll roads and things like that as P3s. But how about in Arizona, where the Game and Fish Department created a P3 engagement? So it's just important to realize that a public-private partnership can almost meet any critical project that needs to be launched.
Yeah, that's great. My wife works at the University of Washington, and she's in the finance department there, and they're using these quite a bit for building projects, and it's a very efficient way for these projects to move forward when we're seeing growing student bodies and the like, and they can get them up and running quickly.
That's true. And so many universities also are around those large facilities. They're bringing in some retail development and working with real estate developers so that the revenue can go on and on and on and can go back to the university as well as to the private sector partner.
That's actually really interesting that you bring that up, because she works in housing and food services. So this combination of food services is in there. And, you know, I tell you what, the students love it. Because they really get a lot of diversity in the campus, you know, a lot of innovation in terms of the ideas. So a lot of things that you've talked about, there's some great real-life examples out there. So let's move on a little bit and talk about, you know, from an agency or government perspective, how do they decide which projects are best for P3s?
Well, I talk to a lot of public officials every week, every month, and they ask me that question. How do we know what will be right for a P3? I think it's important for us to point out that normally a public-private partnership needs to be a large project. Otherwise, we're not going to get the experienced contractors that we want to compete for these projects. Most of them are going to look for something that has a significant public need tied to it. There has to be a payback plan, a revenue stream of some sort. And there needs to be minimal demand risk. And let me give you an example of that. Let's say we're going to construct a brand new parking garage on a university campus, or a public hospital, a parking garage. A contractor does not want to deal with the demand risk. If there's never been a parking garage there, how do we actually project how many cars are actually going to park there? So it's important, both sides are going to look at that. It's extremely important that public officials are aware of that. Contractors want someone at the executive level who is going to champion this, who's going to be the advocate, who's going to remove the roadblocks if that has to happen. And here again, the last one is that stakeholder appeal, that stakeholder buy-in. You don't want to have to fight more challenges, more obstacles than you have to.
Right. I think it's kind of interesting that, you know, we look at these, and a lot of the things that you're mentioning are the things that we actually recommend to our prospects and clients, which is, I think, even more important in P3s, which is this relationship. And you pointed out the need for experience, but that relationship, you know, with the government official, the executive sponsor is really key, I think, to understanding, scoping, making sure that these projects can move forward as a partnership. Is that a good description?
Sure. And I think every contractor who is going to compete wants to know about opportunities as quickly as possible. And actually, most of them want to know about these public projects before they're publicly announced. So it's sort of important to know, how do you anticipate them? How do you find them? How do you identify them and vet them? The slide that's up right now gives some real good hints. Look for areas with rapid growth, a community college system that is just covered up with students, a state that is experiencing historic population growth, something like that. Then look for also regions throughout the country that may have pretty much maxed out their bonding authority. Look for places where bond packages have not passed. Because if a public official knows that a need is so great, they put it in a bond package, and if that election fails, they still have to meet those needs. So sometimes that's a wonderful place to find P3s. And then I will point out that in my company, we do a lot of research. We look at planning documents. We follow public hearings, and we do that on a daily basis. But for the people on this webinar, I think it's good to point out that Onvia is a great source for that type of data. You provide that. They don't have to do the research. So all of those are good ways to find P3s before they are publicly announced.
Yep, that's great. Thank you very much, Mary. That's nice of you to give us a little plug. And I'm sure that services like ours can give you that sort of early visibility to, possible P3 projects, because we track the spending plans, the budgeting, capital improvement plans. So we've got a wealth of information on this. And also, identify the public officials that need, help in developing the P3s. So we can talk a little bit about, how are some, managing, all this? How are some of the agencies managing all this?
Well, a lot of public officials realize that in-house they don't have the appropriate expertise. They don't have the people with experience. And so they reach for outside consultants, and that's a very, very wise thing to do. And I think every potential contractor feels better about competing when that has happened. And so financial services, maybe engineering services, usually a feasibility study, but actually all types of professional services, we see them rushing now to fill that void and to offer their services to public officials. And so that's a very good thing. Before we move on to the next slide, because we're talking about what contractors really are seeking, and I know we have a lot of interested parties on this webinar, so the question I get asked by them so often is this: how do I get a competitive advantage? So let's talk about that if we can. A competitive advantage, and I know this because I was a public official, and I know this because I talk to public officials every day of the world, and here's what they tell me. Contractors get a competitive advantage when they come in and they help us early on. We need their subject matter expertise when we're planning, when we're considering, when we're thinking about this. And a public official will also say, and we know that is costly for them, but it shows us their interest level, it shows us their commitment, it gives us a chance to get to know them and feel comfortable with them. Sharing experiences, especially if a contractor has done P3s, talk about it. Line up the best local subcontractors, because what you're going to see, I believe, is that most P3 competitions are going to give extra points if local subcontractors are a part of the team that is competing. It's important to understand the history, and when I say the history, I really mean the politics also. The public sector is a political world, so understand the history. Why is this project so needed? Who are the stakeholders? What's the politics surrounding it? And then help them develop a very good financing strategy and build relationships all along the way. That's how you get a competitive advantage.
That's great, Mary. I think those are some, really good points out there. We're having another webinar in the not too distant future, next couple of weeks, and it's going to be on social media. And I just mentioned that not so much to promote it, but in doing some of the research for that, we're finding that it is good to really sort of monitor what's going on in the local constituency. And so you sort of pointed to that, that it's great if you can be local or if you can have a local feel. So if you know what the issues are locally and you can have that relationship with an agency and they recognize what those issues are, that can be a huge benefit for you as well in terms of that competitive advantage. So in concluding our discussion on public-private partnerships today, this partnership between the private and the public sector, let's talk a little bit about how do you qualify a good P3 project. Okay,
and probably that's a wonderful way to sort of wrap all of this up. But the final way that you really look at this is if you are a competitor trying to compete for this is look at the transparency aspects of it. Look at the trust factor. Look at the experience level and how the partnership is going to be structured. It sort of wraps up everything we've said, and And really, you know, you have to look at this as a competitor, and then the public official has to look at it from their side, but they're all going to be looking at these same things. How is this partnership going to work? How is this engagement going to be strengthened? How do we make this successful? And that is absolutely the objective of both parties.
Thanks, Mary. So this has been really insightful. You know, I think I would encourage all the attendees to read your book. The title is perfect for describing what needs to happen to make agencies more effective. It's all about collaboration, Collaboration Nation. So what we hope is going to happen in America is that we're going to see more of this. We think that this public-private partnership, P3s, represent a great opportunity to fund badly needed projects and move forward to share the responsibility between the public and private sector for their success and growth. Mary, do you have any final points that you want to conclude with before we move on to questions from our audience?
Sure. I just conclude my comments just like I started. We need to embrace P3s, and I'm hoping that we'll do it immediately. The collaboration that we experience will make us stronger as a nation. We can create thousands of jobs almost immediately. As soon as these projects are launched, the jobs will be there. And we can bring benefit to both partners. The public officials need this, and we can create a wonderful new marketplace for all kinds of contracting firms. And I'll be happy to take questions if any of our listeners have some.
Great. Let me check here, Mary, in just a second. I got to do a little driving. All right. So we have a number of questions from our audience, and by the way, if there's any others, we will continue to ask as long as we have time for. So first one is, how do subcontractors find out about P3 projects? Mary, I'll let you take first on that, and if I can cover a little bit of that as well if you'd like.
Sure. Well, I think probably for subcontractors, and those are normally smaller firms, maybe mid-sized to small firms, it may be harder for them. They don't have research arms to their companies, but the important thing is for them to realize how critically important they are. Most cities, most large cities, have a division that is dedicated to nothing but helping small and minority firms. And so the first thing to do would be simply to get on their radar, call them, go in and say, I know what your mandate is. You're here to help small and minority firms. That's me. How can you help me? I'm looking for a prime contractor who wants to pick up a really good local subcontractor. How do I find those people? And it's amazing how much help cities, counties, state agencies, even the federal government will make available.
Great. The only thing that I would add to it is, again, you know, a service like ours, we provide some of these spending plans, budget plans well in advance, and they give you an opportunity to sort of see what an agency is focused in and then who they might be working with. And so then you can figure, you know, out that there's large projects and you can actually contact those prime contractors off of that.
And Scott, I would just point out that someone who gets, let's say, one of your planning documents and sees a project on there that obviously is going to have a part or a role that they could play, the first thing they need to do is to call someone at the city or the county or the public hospital, whatever the public entity is, and simply say, I need more information about this. And the next question I normally get is, well, who do we call? So I've already said, if there is a small and minority business firm, the call should go there. I mean, a small and minority business division, that's where the call should go. However, let's just say that someone can't find that number or doesn't know whether there is a division like that. There is always a listing for the public information officer for every public entity. That's where a call can go, and the caller can simply say, do you have a division that can help me. I am a small or minority company. I need to ask questions about an upcoming contracting opportunity, and they should link that person immediately.
Right. Okay, so my common question for those that may have joined late is we will be sending out a note on this presentation and recording in the next day or so, so you will get a copy of that if you registered for it. So next question is, what do you define as concessionaires?
Well, a concessionaire would be, let's see, let me give you an example. Let's use a toll road. A private company comes in, builds a toll road, and says we will take our payback in the form of we will collect and keep toll road revenues maybe for, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, and then the road will belong to the state. Or maybe they come in and say, we'll be the concessionaires, we will take 80% of the revenues and give 20% back to the state. But that's how it works. That's what a concessionaire is.
Perfect. So we gave some examples, earlier, and one of the questions related to those is, what were some of the obstacles that may have been faced by some of the examples or, P3 participants, and how were those overcome? And I know that's a hard one because it's probably situational to every P3.
What are some of the obstacles that have to be overcome? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay, so let me take another example. Let's say that a city wants to build a new public housing unit, something like that, and the city wants to put a little retail development around it to offset some of the repayment for the building. An obstacle could be a neighborhood group that comes in and says, we don't want a grocery store here, it's going to create too much traffic, it's going to slow our street flow down, things like that. That could be a problem. There can be political obstacles, and those have to be overcome. Normally a political obstacle is when someone simply doesn't understand enough to realize that there is a sound business plan behind the P3 that's being planned. So there are lots of obstacles. There can be bureaucracy, there can be certification slowdowns, but all of those obstacles can be overcome if you've got two parties working in concert to make it happen.
Good. Okay, so we answered this a little bit, but I think it's worth coming back to a little bit. In your experience, how do P3s materialize? And the follow-up to that is do agencies initiate these conversations, or RFPs, RFIs issued, or do the private entities approach the agencies?
Well, what we've got in America right now is a slowdown because not enough public officials understand, and public officials are not, they don't like change much. They're not too comfortable with it. They're certainly not comfortable with risk. And because this is new and they've not done it before, they are reluctant to jump into a large P3. And so they're dragging their feet. We get calls from cities and regions saying, could you just come spend half a day with just our staff and let us ask questions? And we do, because we've almost become evangelists about this because we see the needs as being so great. But it's really important for the public official to realize this project has to be launched. If there's no funding for it, they sometimes put out an RFI, an RFQ, request for qualifications. They want to know, would someone be interested in it? Is it large enough? What else do we need to add to it if it's not? Is there a payback we can attach to this to give some ROI to our private sector partner? But there are also unsolicited proposals that are taken in every day of the world, maybe to a governor, maybe to a mayor, to a city manager saying, we could do this if you would want to consider it. We could outsource your entire water treatment plant, for instance, and we could operate it more efficiently. We could collect the revenues. We could rebate back to a city. So there's all kinds of different ways that they originate.
Right. Next question, are there any legislative differences with P3s from state to state?
Yes, of course there are, but most states now are trying to coordinate. Virginia was one of the first states to pass some public-private partnership legislation, and many states have simply taken that backbone and have passed statutes that are very similar. What we're seeing across the country is that the statutes that are being passed are trying to very hard not to be so negative or so restrictive that they discourage competition from private sector potential partners.
Okay. You touched a little bit on this, but what about financing sources? What are the financing sources that are typically used in P3s?
Well, interestingly enough, I've mentioned that we get calls from public officials. We also are getting dozens of calls every month from companies with capital who want to get into the funding area of public-private partnerships. And so I will say that there is going to be absolutely no funding shortage. Certainly there's always been bonds, there's things like that. The state of Texas is trying to free up $2 billion right now for water, to encourage water projects, not to pay for them, but to help with them, to incentivize regions to launch them. But I will also say that I think that one of the strongest funding sources is going to come from private sector firms who don't want to do the construction, who don't want to do the operation, who don't want to build or operate anything, just want to provide the funding. And that is, that's very interesting.
So we talked a little bit about how large these projects are. There's a question here. Are there any incentivized goals to work with companies who are veteran-owned and are women-owned businesses?
Oh, yes. And as I said earlier, every one of the public-private partnership engagement structures are customized. But especially from cities and counties, you're going to see extra points given for veteran-owned businesses, for small businesses, for women-owned, minority subcontractors. So it's a wonderful incentive for them. But they need to get in the middle of this movement, and they need to ask about mentor-mentee programs, because most cities are launching those now.
Great. So a contractor that's involved in a P3 or trying to get involved in one, is the contractor negotiating with both the public and the private players when they attempt to sell their goods or services?
Well, if you take a prime contractor who wants to pursue an opportunity, let's say well, let's take a city, because that's an easy one to talk about. Yes, they've got to cover their bases, be very, very good in competing at the city level, and at the same time, they've got to go out and compete for the best local subcontractors. And so they are negotiating on all fronts. They're negotiating with those subs to be a part of their team. They're negotiating with the city on cost and structure and terms and conditions. And so it is a complicated process, and experience does help.
Yeah. I think also to that point, I mean, we recommend to a lot of our clients, again, that they look at past award information, which goes to that sort of where is that experience. And so we talked a little bit about the subcontracting side of it earlier, and there's great opportunities to find out who has that experience that you might be reaching out to with past award information. So that history is oftentimes a good source of information who you can get out to. I think we covered this in the slide too, and so I think it's growing, but I'll ask the question anyway. Are P3s allowed in every state and unit of government? And if not, can you highlight some of the states that allow it and some that don't?
You know, I don't know of any state that has outlawed a public-private partnership because even though we didn't call them P3s, that's gone on forever. One of the misconceptions is that a P3 is the same thing as a major outsourcing, and that is not true. But no, I don't think they are banned anywhere at any jurisdictional level in any state. If they are, I don't know of it. Some states encourage it more than other states do. Some states are embracing the whole concept more. But no, I think they're totally legitimate anywhere.
All right. So we talked a little bit about the financing, and there's a question here: can you identify the types of financial experts who play a critical role in P3s? You know, are they the CPAs, commercial bankers, investment bankers, private equity and real estate funds, or all of the above?
Well, it's actually all of the above. Depending on what the project is and what the needs are, there may need to be, well, let's just take one example. Some cities and some states are calling in a financial firm and saying, we want you to inventory all of our assets, and we want you to look at the non-performing assets. We might want to monetize them in some way or another. On another engagement, we might need someone who knows how to do financial modeling, financial projections, demand projections, better than a public entity has in-house. So I would say audit services are going to be high, engineering services are going to be high, probably inventorying, but all kinds of financial services will be utilized.
Right. So we've got time for just a couple more. The range of projects is so vast, but in Mary's experience, what is the average length of investment to turn participation into profitable revenue? That's a hard one, Mary. Sorry about that.
Right, that's a hard one, but it depends. It totally depends on how large the project is and what kind of payback plan is going to be put in place. Sometimes a city or a county or a public hospital or a state agency will say, we've got this much funding and we're going to commit this much funding along with, let's say, the land or whatever else they have to put into the project. And we only need a limited amount from the private sector partner. That's going to be a much shorter payback than a, billion-dollar road or a billion-dollar job of dredging the channels at a major port. And on those very, very huge projects, it could easily be 30 years to pay back. But almost always in a P3, the public entity is going to own the asset at the end of the engagement.
Great. My apologies, Mary. I promised I wouldn't answer or ask any really hard ones, and that one sort of slipped through, but you did a beautiful job with it. One last one. So we talked about the need for transparency and collaboration, especially related to government agencies. How open are government agencies to use collaborative technologies like cloud-based platforms to collaborate? Yeah, that's it.
Well, maybe, 4 years ago they might have been more reluctant than they are today, but what's happened is cloud computing has offered so much cost reduction to public officials that they've had no choice but to adopt it. So it's not new to them. You're going to find some law enforcement agencies that may be a little bit squeamish about using that, and they may not do it. But I don't see that as a huge barrier anymore. The transparency issue is a reality, and the security on cloud, cloud services and so forth is very, very good. I don't see that as a huge barrier.
Great. All right, so we are at 15 minutes to the hour, and we've scheduled this for 45 minutes, so we've met sort of our time deadline. I think we've covered most of the questions today for the webinar. I want to again thank our speaker, Mary Scott Nabers, and we really appreciate your helping us understand this sort of revolutionary way that governments are going about pursuing large projects. If any of the audience has any follow-on questions, please feel free to email them to me, and I will get Mary to answer them or try to answer them directly for you. So at this point, we're going to end our conversation. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Take care.